Welcome to History Twists. This is part two of the Annexation disaster episode. If you haven't listened to part one, that sort of sets the stage concerning the idea of annexing Canada, Mexico, and Greenland. In part one, we really focused for the main part on the military campaign and that sort of thing. In this part, we take a look at some consequences. So, at one point, about a week into the conflict, there was a real scare in this proposed history. Radar detected what was thought to be a submarine-launched ballistic missile off the eastern seaboard. For a few terrifying minutes, U.S. early warning systems lit up. It turned out to be a false alarm, possibly a technical glitch, or some might suspect a Russian electronic warfare trick. But those minutes saw the world on the knife edge of Armageddon, thankfully. Cooler heads on both sides prevailed, and no one pressed any red buttons. But the message was unmistakable with tensions this high. One misstep or miscalculation could unleash nuclear devastation. The world was literally one error away from catastrophe.
Diplomatically, there were some attempts to mediate. The United Nations Secretary General dispatched envoys to Washington, but they were rebuffed. The new Pope pleaded for peace. A few countries offered asylum to Canadian and Mexican leaders, but the U.S. administration was intransigent. It declared that the annexations were an internal North American matter. In a surreal twist, U.S. officials even tried to argue in the UN that they were invited or liberating these countries, claiming that the Canadian and Mexican governments had failed their people and that American intervention was humanitarian only, an argument nobody bought.
The global economy, meanwhile, began to teeter from the shock, which brings us to the next aspect of this crisis. Militarily, the initial blitz was over in days. But holding on to conquered territory is a far different challenge. As U.S. forces settled into occupation roles in Canada and Mexico, they immediately faced growing resistance movements. History has shown that taking a country is one thing, keeping it is quite another.
In Canada, the landscape of resistance ranged from the big cities to the remote wilderness. The Canadian Army units that hadn't been destroyed or captured melted away into the vast forests in the Northern Territories. A national resistance network started to coalesce almost immediately. Remember, Canada is the second largest country on Earth by land area, an occupier's nightmare in terms of trying to secure it. Within a week, small-scale attacks began. In British Columbia, a convoy of U.S. supply trucks was ambushed on a mountain highway by Canadian reservists using IEDs, reminiscent of insurgent tactics from Iraq. In Quebec, patriotic hackers, possibly university students and IT workers, launched cyber attacks that briefly knocked out power in parts of occupied Montreal and disrupted U.S. military communications.
Canadian civilians proved far from docile. Many communities engaged in acts of civil disobedience, organizing strikes, hiding Canadian soldiers, refusing to cooperate with occupation authorities. A resistance group calling itself the Maple Leaf Alliance started broadcasting clandestine radio updates, rallying people to the cause of freedom. They urged sabotage. They said, cut railway ties, disable few depots, jam communication gear. And people heeded the call. One Reddit forum turned underground newsletter laid out a blueprint for making the occupation unsustainable, noting that the sheer size and harsh terrain of Canada would work in our favor. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes, hit and run tactics could stretch their resources thin, like Vietnam or Afghanistan. That was from the Washingtonian.com. They talked about sabotaging infrastructure, blowing up bridges and rail lines to create chaos for U.S. logistics. They even suggested leveraging cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure and rallying global diplomatic pressure to isolate the U.S. In effect, Canadians plan to outlast the occupier, make the cost of control outweigh the benefits, as they said. It was the classic insurgent strategy.
The U.S. military now faced an evolving guerrilla war on its northern flank. To counter it, American occupation forces imposed curfews and checkpoints in major Canadian cities. They rounded up former Canadian military personnel and suspected resistance leaders. There were ominous reports of detention camps being set up at bases in Alberta and Ontario for those deemed insurgents or terrorists. Inevitably, some heavy-handed crackdowns occurred. A protest in Calgary by unarmed civilians was dispersed by U.S. troops using tear gas and rubber bullets. And in the chaos, shots were fired. Several protesters were killed. Such incidents only fueled hatred and determination among Canadians. What the U.S. had hoped would be a quick assimilation was turning into a quagmire.
In Mexico, resistance was, if anything, even fiercer. The Mexican populace, long skeptical of U.S. intentions, was enraged by the invasion. Many of Mexico's soldiers, once their units were shattered, reformed as guerrilla bands, especially in the mountainous South and Central Highlands. Indigenous communities in Chiapas and Guerrero armed themselves, invoking memories of historic resistance. Perhaps ironically, some of the drug cartels that the U.S. ostensibly invaded to eliminate reorganized into makeshift militias. And this was probably not so much out of patriotism, but to protect their turf from foreign occupiers. In some regions, strange bedfellows emerged, cartel gunmen and Mexican army holdouts who used to be enemies, now both shooting at U.S. patrols.
Talk about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. American troops in Mexican cities face daily unrest. In Mexico City, even after its official fall, the U.S. only controlled zones, not the entire metropolis. At night, the streets belonged to the guerrillas. Sniper attacks, hit and run assaults on U.S. checkpoints, and acts of sabotage became common. A unit of U.S. soldiers patrolling a suburb would find their convoy hit by roadside bombs. Weapons likely scavenged from the Mexican army or improvised with mining explosives. As one U.S. officer reportedly commented, "It's Fallujah on steroids down here." The sprawling urban neighborhoods of Mexico City and Guadalajara were nearly impossible to secure fully. Any alley or rooftop could hide a fighter with an RPG.
The U.S. responded by pouring in more troops. The initial invasion force of perhaps a couple 100,000, split across both countries, was not enough for long-term occupation. By the second month, U.S. troop levels had surged, with National Guard units federalized and sent overseas, or rather overland, into Canada and Mexico. Still, the insurgencies only grew. They were fed by local knowledge and righteous anger. Outside support also trickled in. Reportedly, weapons and supplies for Canadian and Mexican resistance fighters were being covertly shipped in through third countries. There were rumors of European intelligence agencies accidentally, quote unquote, leaving arms stockpiles in accessible places, or of sympathizers crowdfunding supplies. Even Russia and China, while not intervening directly, likely had no qualms seeing the U.S. bogged down. There were unconfirmed reports of Chinese-made shoulder-fired anti-air missiles showing up in the hands of Mexican guerrillas, for instance.
Greenland, with its tiny population, about 56,000 people, saw a different kind of resistance, mostly passive and nonviolent, but symbolically powerful. The Greenlandic Inuit population held mass civil disobedience campaigns in Nuuk and other towns. Residents refused to go to work, effectively shutting down the economy under the U.S. occupation. Danish and Greenlandic flags were painted everywhere as acts of defiance. A few Danish special forces, with support from local hunters, attempted a daring raid on an American held airfield in northern Greenland, sabotaging a radar installation before disappearing into the icy wilderness. The environment itself became a foe for the occupiers. U.S. troops, mostly unaccustomed to the extreme Arctic climate, struggled with supply lines over frozen vast distances. There was no organized armed insurgency in Greenland, but the occupiers were isolated and uneasy, knowing the locals resented them and the rest of the world regarded them as illegal invaders.
All the while, an information war raged. The U.S. tried to control the narrative by cutting off internet and international news in the occupied areas. But people found ways, satellite phones, clandestine radios, smuggled SIM cards, to get the word out. Videos of protests and brutal crackdowns in Toronto and Mexico City circulated globally, fueling outrage. The resistance movements also put out their own media. Videos of captured U.S. soldiers pleading for an end to the war, or dramatic footage of guerrilla successes, aiming to erode American morale. Washington dismissed many as terrorist propaganda, unquote. But the impact was clear. The longer this went on, the more untenable it became, both abroad and at home.
As if the military and political fallout weren't enough, the economic consequences of this annexation gambit were severe and immediate. Virtually overnight, the United States became a global pariah in trade and finance. Allies imposed sweeping sanctions. The European Union, for example, froze U.S. government assets in Europe and banned exports of critical technologies. Canada and Mexico, which together accounted for roughly a third of all U.S. trade, of course, fell into chaos, disrupting supply chains. The NAFTA USMCA economic zone was obliterated in one blow. Cross border commerce, normally totaling hundreds of billions of dollars annually, came to a standstill.
The U.S. dollar began to plummet in value as confidence in America's stability eroded. Remember, the U.S. currency has been the world's reserve currency for decades. That status now came into question. Countries started dumping U.S. Treasury bonds. Some central banks discussing removing the dollar from their reserves or from oil contracts. Financial markets were in free fall. The New York Stock Exchange never even opened the day after the invasion. A trading halt was imposed as futures indicated a massive crash. When it did reopen days later, it plunged precipitously. The Dow Jones and the S&P indexes suffered record losses.
Global markets also convulsed. This was an economic black swan event no one had modeled, the world's largest economy turning rogue. Oil prices spiked sharply, even though the conflict was not in the Middle East. Traders feared instability and potential U.S. sanctions retaliation. Major U.S. trading partners like China also had to recalculate. China, for instance, relied on U.S. consumers and also held over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Now, Beijing froze some financial dealings, and there was talk it might seize U.S. owned assets in China in retaliation for the chaos.
Meanwhile, corporations scrambled. Multinational companies with operations in North America were thrown into disarray. Factories in Mexico that supplied U.S. manufacturers shut down due to the fighting or seizures by U.S. forces. Canadian exports of oil, lumber, and minerals halted, causing commodity price swings. Tech companies reliant on cross border teams and supply chains faced paralysis. The U.S. government, under heavy sanctions, tried to assure markets that it could weather the storm, but with much of the world boycotting U.S. goods and refusing to trade, Americans saw prices for basic goods skyrocket. Shortages began to appear. From electronics and machinery, previously imported from allies now sanctioning the U.S., to everyday commodities.
The financial isolation of the U.S. deepened. The once dominant Wall Street banks were cut out of many international transactions. There were scenes of Americans lining up at banks as they did during the Depression to withdraw cash amid fears of financial system instability. The Federal Reserve took emergency measures, slashing interest rates and injecting liquidity, but these were band-aids on a gaping wound. Inflation roared to life as the cost of imports soared due to a collapsing dollar and tariffs slapped by other nations, was an economic self-inflicted wound on top of a geopolitical one.
Humanitarian crises quickly followed. The conflict zones in Canada and Mexico produced refugee exoduses on a scale not seen in modern North America. In Canada, tens of thousands of Canadians fled their homes near conflict areas. Many tried to make it to Alaska, ironically, U.S. territory, but relatively safe from the fighting, or to Greenland or Iceland by sea. Others headed for Europe. Sympathetic nations like the UK and France quietly began organizing airlifts for Canadian refugees where possible. Within weeks, an estimated 2 million Canadians were displaced internally or had fled abroad, seeking safety wherever they could.
In Mexico, the humanitarian situation was even more dire. The invasion and subsequent fighting in cities caused massive displacement. Millions of Mexicans from northern states and from Mexico City and other battle zones fled southward into the countryside or toward the borders with Guatemala and Belize. A full-fledged refugee crisis unfolded as desperate families tried to cross into these neighboring countries, which struggled to accommodate the sudden influx. International aid organizations, from the Red Cross to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, mobilized what resources they could, setting up camps in southern Mexico and Central America to shelter people fleeing the violence. But access was difficult. U.S. forces at times blocked or restricted humanitarian convoys, especially if they suspected arms could be smuggled in with relief supplies.
Casualties mounted by the day. While the initial invasions were swift, the subsequent urban battles in Mexico and sporadic fighting in Canada and Greenland led to significant civilian suffering. In Mexico City alone, the death toll from the week of fighting and bombings was estimated in the tens of thousands, including many civilians caught in the crossfire or victims of collapsed buildings and interrupted medical care. Canadian cities saw fewer civilian casualties initially, but the hardship grew as shortages set in. Power outages, fuel scarcity, and medication shortages hit places like Toronto and Vancouver after those supply lines fractured.
The images that did leak out were heartbreaking. A Canadian mother carrying her child through the rubble of what used to be a border town neighborhood, Mexican families crowded onto freight trains heading south, children crying from hunger, Greenlandic villagers huddling in the cold after their power generators ran out of fuel because supply ships stopped arriving. These humanitarian impacts further isolated the U.S. morally. The world saw America causing refugee crises and misery, something more previously associated with authoritarian regimes or war-torn failed states.
The international aid response was hamstrung by the political situation. Normally, in a crisis, the U.S. itself is a major aid donor and coordinator. Now, the U.S. was the cause, and it blocked many aid efforts as, quote, interference. Still, NGOs and the UN did what they could. Cargo planes from Europe delivered supplies to parts of Canada not under tight U.S. control, like perhaps remote northern airstrips. In Mexico's case, some aid trickled in through the southern border. Cuba, interestingly, sent doctors to Mexico just as they had to other disaster zones as an act of solidarity, scoring propaganda points against the U.S.
Conditions inside the United States also began to deteriorate as the war dragged on and the economy buckled. We should turn to that now, the storm brewing at home.
Yeah, this is all really chilling. Within the United States, what started as patriotic fervor in some circles quickly turned to shock and division as the reality of this war set in. In the initial hours of the invasion, President Trump's base and many Americans caught up in the wave of propaganda rallied around the flag. Nationalistic rhetoric flooded the airwaves, with some media personalities calling it a unification of North America or the completion of manifest destiny. But as reports of casualties and the harsh global backlash grew, public opinion split sharply.
In cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, and Boston, massive protests erupted within days of the annexation news. These were unlike any protests seen in the U.S. in decades, millions of Americans taking to the streets, outraged that their country had launched an unprovoked war of conquest. Signs and chants of "Not in my name," "Stop the annexation," and "Americans against invasion" filled the streets. In Washington, D.C., a crowd gathered outside the White House despite heavy security, chanting for peace and at times clashing with the Secret Service and troops guarding the perimeter. The memory of the Vietnam War protests, or even the 2003 Iraq War protests, paled in comparison to this. Never before since the Civil War had Americans protested en masse against their own country's aggression of this
The
magnitude.
U.S. government responded with increasing force. President Trump, facing what he called, quote, internal sabotage, invoked the Insurrection Act, deploying active duty military units to quell riots in American cities. Effectively, martial law was declared in several areas. National Guard troops, ironically, some of the same troops or units that were not sent abroad, patrolled the streets of Washington, D.C. and New York. A curfew was imposed in dozens of cities. The images were astonishing. U.S. soldiers in full combat gear standing off against crowds of American civilians in front of the Capitol and city halls. Tear gas and water guns were used frequently. Thousands of protesters were arrested nationwide. In some instances, violence spiked. In Los Angeles, a protest turned deadly when an armed group and soldiers exchanged gunfire after a chaotic confrontation at a barricade. The political system was in turmoil. In Congress, a handful of courageous lawmakers, both Democrats and some Republicans, spoke out against the war, calling it unconstitutional and morally abhorrent. They were quickly silenced. The president's allies moved to censure or remove dissenters. Rumors swirled that a faction in the cabinet considered invoking the 25th Amendment to declare the president unfit.
Those who might have supported it were summarily fired or resigned under pressure. The administration became an echo chamber of hardliners. Dissent within the military's top brass also emerged. There were reports that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff privately opposed the invasion plan and was subsequently replaced when he refused to enthusiastically endorse the ongoing operations. Several high ranking generals resigned, only to be replaced by more compliant officers. This led to a chilling effect down the ranks. Officers and soldiers who objected faced court martial or expulsion. Yet, discontent simmered among many service members, particularly those now ordered to occupy cities full of people who looked and spoke just like their families back home in Canada, or who clearly saw them as oppressors, as in Mexico.
The media environment inside the U.S. shifted towards outright propaganda as the government clamped down. Citing national security, federal authorities muzzled or took over media outlets that were too critical. Sound familiar? Some journalists were detained under espionage or sedition accusations for reporting on U.S. military setbacks or civilian casualties. Major social media platforms, under strong government pressure, filtered, quote, content, which in practice meant removing posts criticizing the war or showing images unfavorable to the U.S. narrative. Despite this, word still spread via encrypted apps and underground blogs. The censorship only fueled more anger among the populace that knew something was wrong.
American society began to fracture deeply. While some continued to support the war, often influenced by nationalist media or simply rallying around the flag, a significant portion of Americans descended into open civil dissent. Families were divided, friendships torn apart. There were even instances of small scale violence, pro war and anti war demonstrators brawling in the streets, and in a few extreme cases, politically motivated shootings. One tragic incident occurred when a group of armed ultra nationalist vigilantes believing they were aiding Homeland Security, attacked the church in Michigan that was sheltering Canadian refugees. Several innocent people were killed. The country felt on the brink of internal collapse.
Facing widespread unrest, the government resorted to more draconian measures. The president issued an executive order suspending habeas corpus for offenses related to national stability, unquote, echoing the darkest moments of the Civil War and World War II internments. Thousands of anti war activists, community leaders, and even opposition politicians were detained by federal agents on vague charges. Makeshift detention centers were set up, some at military bases, to hold these domestic security threats. Human rights groups, to the extent they could, decried this as the birth of an authoritarian regime.
In some states and cities, local authorities openly defied federal orders. The governors of California and Massachusetts, for example, criticized the martial law declaration and refused to deploy their National Guard against protesters, risking a constitutional showdown. There were whispers of some states considering legal challenges or even the previously unthinkable talk of secession if the federal government continued down this path. Though it did not materialize into any formal secession, the mere murmur of it underscored how fractured the Union had become internally.
The American economy's tailspin also fueled domestic anger. Unemployment soared as international trade dried up and economic structures bit hard. Factories closed due to lack of parts or export markets. Agriculture suffered as well. U.S. farmers lost big markets in Canada, Mexico, and beyond. And some crops rotted as supply chains just weren't there. Inflation made basic goods expensive, very expensive. People's savings lost value. The war effort, costing billions per day, strained federal finances, leading to cutbacks and uncertainty in social programs. Many Americans now not only hated the war on moral grounds, but felt it directly in their wallets and their daily lives.
In the midst of this, a brave coalition of civic leaders, mayors, ex-governors, retired military officers, and civil rights figures attempted to organize a national anti-war strike. They called for Americans to stop work and school for a week in protest. This strike saw partial success. In some cities, streets emptied as people stayed home in solidarity. But in others, especially areas where the government kept tight control or where war supporters were strong, participants risked arrest. Still, the message was sent. A substantial number of Americans did not consent to this
The
war.
federal government's legitimacy was now under question. America's long held democratic principles seemed to be fading. The international community began referring to the U.S. government as a rogue regime or expansionist authoritarian state. Some opposition U.S. lawmakers who managed to flee the country set up a kind of government in exile forum in the UK to rally global support for American democracy. A stunning reversal of roles, as traditionally it's dissidents from authoritarian countries who do that.
And all the while, flag-draped coffins began returning home. The U.S. military casualties, initially low during the Blitz, climbed steadily as guerrilla warfare took its toll. Funerals for American soldiers became daily occurrences in towns across America. Initially, they were hailed as heroes, but as the war dragged on, some families refused to accept the folded flag, instead openly blaming the administration for their loss. Veterans of past wars, including Iraq and Afghanistan, were some of the most vocal critics, having fought insurgencies abroad. They knew firsthand the futility and horrors that were now playing out on a much larger scale.
By now, perhaps just a few months into the war, the United States was under a form of internal siege while it occupied its neighbors under literal siege. It's a dark, dark picture, and one that seemed to have no end in sight.
So, where does this all leave us? The campaign that was supposed to make America greater and more secure has instead left North America in chaos and the United States internationally reviled and internally fractured. It's hard to overstate just how dark this alternate present has become.
In Canada, Mexico, and Greenland, the annexation remains incomplete and vehemently resisted. These countries, or former countries, are now scarred by war and occupation. The U.S. may have planted flags in their capitals, but it hasn't won hearts and minds. Instead, it has likely ensured generations of bitterness. A Canadian or Mexican child who lost parents in an airstrike or saw soldiers on their street will grow up remembering that. The violence unleashed in a matter of days will take decades to heal, if it ever could heal.
Globally, the ripple effects are profound. The post 1945 world order, based on the idea that borders shouldn't be changed by force and that great powers should uphold rules, has been fundamentally broken. Allies no longer trust the United States. Adversaries are emboldened, but also on hair trigger alert. International institutions like the United Nations and NATO have been deeply undermined. After all, if the most powerful country can ignore them, what power do they really have? We're likely entering a much more unstable and dangerous era in world politics, with new alliances forming out of necessity to contain an unpredictable America. Some talk about a new Cold War, but it's messier than that. The U.S. isn't the leader of the free world anymore. It's a rogue superpower, and the rest of the world is scrambling to adapt.
Inside the United States, the soul of the nation is at stake. Democracy, once America's proudest export, is on life support at home, at best. The precedent has been set that if a government can justify enough fear or anger, it can override the Constitution, suppress dissent, and wage war at will. Even if this regime were to fall or reverse course, the scars on American society and its democratic institutions would be deep. Trust in government is shattered among many. Trust in each other is frayed. The United States of America, as we knew it, might well cease to exist in the form that we recognize, whether through political breakup, sustained martial law, or simply a transformation into something far, far different than a constitutional republic.
And what about the human cost? By now, casualties on all sides, Americans, Canadians, Mexicans, Danes, and Greenlanders, likely number in the hundreds of thousands when you count military and civilians together. Millions are displaced. These are not just numbers, these are families torn apart, futures cut short. The humanitarian crisis will be a shadow over this continent for a generation. In Mexico and Canada, economies lie in ruins, institutions decapitated. They will need rebuilding from the ground up whenever the fighting stops. Greenland's autonomy has been smothered under foreign occupation.
One wonders, what was it all for? The stated U.S. motivations, eliminating cartels, securing trade, controlling resources, ring hollow against the staggering costs. The cartels are still there, now brandishing a twisted freedom fighter image. Trade is devastated, not improved. Resources are inaccessible. or tarnished by conflict. And security? Yeah, the U.S. is more insecure than it has ever been. Isolated, hated, and constantly under threat of insurgent attacks or global escalation.
In a broader historical sense, this alternate present is a cautionary tale about hubris, the perversion of patriotism, and the fragility of the international order. We've seen echoes of this story before in speculative fiction and war games, but to live it, even hypothetically, is sobering. It forces us to ask, how resilient is our system of checks and balances, our alliances, our commitment to the rule of law? What might drive a democracy to destroy others and itself in the process?
As we close this episode, there is an image that sticks in my mind. It's near the end of the second week of the annexation. A photograph circulates, one of the few uncensored ones. It shows a group of ordinary people, Canadians, Mexicans, Americans, standing together in a ruined street, helping each other pull rubble away to free someone trapped underneath it. They're not soldiers or politicians, just civilians caught in this nightmare, cooperating purely out of human decency. That kind of image, to me, is a kind of glimmer of hope. It says that even when political leaders and generals drive nations to conflict, people on the ground can still recognize each other's humanity.
Perhaps that recognition is what could one day help piece back together a shattered peace. Perhaps international pressure, internal resistance, and sheer unsustainability will eventually halt the U.S. annexation and compel a withdrawal. But even if the tanks go home, it will be a long road to rebuild trust between nations and within America itself.
The lessons of this dark episode would be studied for generations. It stands as a stark reminder of how quickly the norms we take for granted can crumble, and how critical it is that we safeguard the principles of peace, democracy, and mutual respect every single day.
We hope that this exploration, as difficult as it was, serves as more than just a frightening tale. Let it be a warning from history of the paths we must never take.
Hey, you've been listening to History Twists. I do thank you for joining us in examining this harrowing alternate reality. Stay safe. Remember the principles of the Republic. Remember the importance of news not being tampered with, not being censored and squashed. Stay safe and cherish peace. And hey, come back and join us again. We got some other good stuff coming your way. And if you want to leave us a comment, that would be great. Certainly hope that you'd like to subscribe. And if you have other ideas that you'd like us to explore, please let us know. But for now, bye.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As Dr. Weaver said, we cherish doing these, even unpleasant stories like this one. We hope to hear from you soon. Take care.